we are again on one of these videos about what's required for on-the-job learning. In our last video, we talked about how to start the mentoring agreement. So today we're going to briefly reprise that, and then kind of build on it and develop it with a particular focus on learning needs and opportunities. So clarify content of the agreement very shortly, very briefly. Have a little quick look at some of the sections we've already talked about in more detail elsewhere, and then to look at learning needs and opportunities in particular. So it's aligned to the BASW, British Association of Social Workers, PCF, Professional Capabilities Framework, at the level of readiness for practice. You should familiarize yourself with those standards, very helpful as a guide to how you might complete this particular task. We assume, as ever, that apprentices have considerable existing knowledge and skills, and we expect everybody to be able to evidence those and their new skills and knowledge by the end of the first academic year. The readiness for practice level, or DEP, covers the whole of the year, so roughly from September to the end of June in the following year. You'll submit a portfolio, and you'll already have been given some instructions how to do that, and you will get fed more information of what's required. But really, the mentoring agreement is one of the main things. So the sections of the agreement, we've already dealt with some of this, and so we'll see, what will we focus on today, I wonder. We've already talked about developing the working relationship, perhaps using some of the tools we suggested, or whatever you feel is appropriate yourselves. We've focused a little bit on apprentices' strengths, thinking about the different layers of that. They might be personal, they might be professional skills and knowledge, they might be training, whatever it happens to be, specialisms that people have acquired over the years. But in general, you're coming to the program not as novices, but as perhaps expert novices. Is that making any sense? Anyway, you know a few things, and now you're going to kind of develop on that very solid base to develop your professional identity and, of course, achieve your degree. There was, of course, the roles and responsibilities section. Again, always useful to be very clear about what's involved there. Who is doing what? Who is the university tutor, the line manager, the mentor? Talk it through. But again, if you have any questions, the same with any other aspect, talk to your module leader or other course staff. We'll be more than happy to help you out. So we've kind of grayed out the sections that we talked already. And now we're into things like apprenticeship, suitability, status verification, etc. So let's have a little look at what the next sections are. So the status verification is simply that. It shows that you're still a suitable person to be trained in as a professional social worker. So this usually involves asking you, have you acquired any criminal convictions or charges, or have you been involved with social services or perhaps the LADO in your local area? Now, it's unlikely that all of those things or any of those things will have occurred, but we're required by Social Work England to update and to ask you those questions in every year of your study. Accessibility and support needs. Now that's a little bit more detailed and likely to be more relevant for more people. So first of all, not everybody's current job role may have the learning opportunities that are needed. So the sooner we kind of recognize that, the sooner then we can talk about arrangements for kind of moving in that job role. You are going to be starting to be comprehensive about your learning needs, but of course, you're not going to be able to do them all in the first year, so don't even try. Kind of attempt to be a little bit modest about those, and we'll come back to them again. So in addition to thinking about, is the current job role affording you enough opportunities for your learning and development, you must also think about what other blocks, barriers, or obstacles there might be to your learning. And these might be things, for example, about caring responsibilities and quite simply managing the time between study, work, and other caring responsibilities that a person might have. They also might be about physical constraints on a person's ability to achieve um, the degree, essentially, really. So, are there reasonable adjustments that either the employer or the university should be putting in place to enable people to do their best on this course? And if so, perhaps this is time to be talking about them and making sure plans are in place. It might be access to work, it might be software, it might be your chair. Well, let's talk about that. People, for example, with the chairs, it's difficult to learn if you're in pain because what you're sitting on is not suitable, for example. Also, every year we generally have a number of students who are for the first time assessed as having a learning difficulty, quite typically dyslexia, but not only dyslexia. And those assessments are easily and freely available at the university, and there's a lot of support around those assessments and reasonable adjustments and other support that we can make in relation to anything that arises from them. So it's not an uncommon experience for quite a few of our students. And if that is the case, we should be talking about that here in the mentoring agreement to make sure that there's, I suppose, an official track record of that being spoken about and being planned for. So then we go on to the learning needs and opportunities section. Now you've already kind of identified your strengths, and from there you'll have started a conversation about your learning needs, and there are several different ways to approach that. And you'll see the template looks a bit like this, that you state the activity, what's the learning opportunity, and then what will be hoped to be learned from this opportunity. Gets quite complicated and detailed, but one of the first questions people typically ask is, how many of these do you want, Dermot? And I kind of go, maybe the number isn't the right way to go about this. Maybe we need to be as comprehensive as we possibly can be in identifying and describing these learning opportunities, and have some suggestions in the following slides about how you might do that. But if I'm seeing 3 or 4 here, I'm thinking probably not, because my guess is the average working place offers many more opportunities than 3 or 4. So they don't all have to be entirely new things either. They might be developing your existing practice knowledge and skills. So really taken or seen through that lens, perhaps that starts to widen our scope a little bit. I'll also talk a little bit about how you might write them. So again, I suppose the spirit of the program in general, collaboration is the way to go. And you will be working these out with your mentor, and you will get a little bit of feedback also from your university tutor to see if you're on the right track. You have quite a while to do this document because we'd far prefer you take your time and do it thoroughly than hit some kind of far too soon date and kind of have a half-formed set of learning opportunities. It is still readiness for practice. You don't have to be too ambitious. You're not going to get everything done in the first term of the first year. It's a good idea, perhaps, to involve the manager because it may have impacts on your allocated workload, and on occasion, some of the learning opportunities may be outside your current team. May require you to go elsewhere for a little period of time. So you can't really be doing that kind of stuff without involving your line manager. Over time, all these kind of agreements are reviewed. So you'll do this in the first semester, it'll be reviewed again early in the spring, and then there will be a final review in towards the end of the course, is usually April, May, June, sometime around then. Certainly in good time for your final submission, which is usually middle or end of June. So there'll be a lot more about reviews and what we're looking for then, but it's a further chance to develop this document and I suppose, in a sense, to make it a live thing. With learning opportunities, again, it's a process that initially you might observe, practice, see how other people do things, and then be more independent and uh, do some new tasks with support and guidance. And as things progress, you will do things more independently. So that would happen both within any given year and over the life of the 3 years of the course. So how about you generate these? How much you write them? There's the kind of questions that we're going to attempt at least to answer. And I don't know, might seem a little overly complex, but in actual fact, it's not too difficult. I mean, the first kind of assumption we would make is that there are plenty of things that the average apprentice is seeing other people doing, but is not, for various different reasons, quite often legislative reasons, allowed to do themselves. So we need to start moving into those territories, as it were, and starting to get experience and starting to do those things as a learner. Now, here's a couple of ways you could do it. For example, you could start with what typically happens in the team. Think about all the various tasks, all the various roles, and you might think of things that happen maybe every day, things that happen maybe every week or every month, and things that definitely do happen, but less frequently. So every team will have a little list of these, and I'm sure your colleagues, once you sat down and start going through it, you won't find it too difficult to generate a lot of information about what's actually done. You could also start with the standards. That's a little bit more tricky, really. And for some of the standards, it'll be easier than others. So for PCF1 professionalism, I mean, professionalism is or should be in every single thing you do. With PCF9 leadership, a little bit more difficult. You will have some input in class about the professional standards, not really the place or the time here to go through those, but some people actually use the standards as a way of generating those opportunities. So typically what happens every day is you answer the phone, and I'm going to laboriously use answering the phone as an example of a learning opportunity. It might seem a bit ridiculous or even patronizing, but please bear with me, and I'm hoping it will make some sense by the time we get to the end. Things that happen less frequently, maybe home visits, of course, in some teams that may not be the case, and hardly ever, perhaps, is presenting to the team, things of that nature. You could start off with skills and interventions, but very quickly what you will find is that something like a home visit will match a whole series of the PCF. It's obviously professionalism because that includes how you present yourself and represent the agency, but also how you, how would I say, um, prepare for visits and interactions with people. It may well have got something to do with ethical practice and diversity and equality, depending on the circumstance. But given that this is social work, that's probably going to be applicable PCF 2 and 3 to most of our practice. Now, a home visit may not result in reflection, as in PCF 6, but it certainly will after the fact. And it obviously shows something about interventions and skills, 7, context and organizations, 8, and of course you may be leading on practice for 9. And you kind of think, oh, so this is this one opportunity and may actually result in a whole load of evidence. That's okay. When you're writing the opportunities, they can actually match up with more than one PCF, but try to make sure that they only link to a limited number. We don't really like to see PCF 1 to 9. Now, you could make an argument for most things that you could find some way of justifying 1 to 9, but that would be disingenuous, I would say, at best. So try to find the PCFs that match most strongly to whatever the activity might be. Of course, learning is a little bit unpredictable. You might put the opportunity up, then what actually happens and what you learn from it might be a very different thing, but that's just in the nature of learning, is it not? So as a general note, and I suppose this is what we're thinking about, you could think of opportunities of your plan about what you intend to do. And as you work to the plan, and some of these are achieved, say by the review point, it will start to generate new ideas. Okay, I did this, and from doing that thing, I noticed that I need to do more of this. So the review may add on learning opportunities that are generated by following the plan. You might reasonably ask, well, Dermot, how am I going to keep a record of all of this? Well, we have a way of doing that. It'll be very familiar to a lot of people, and it is called the index of evidence. So the opportunities are the plan, what I am going to do, and the index of evidence is the record of what I did. The two things are strongly linked, but we'll have a separate video about the index of evidence at a later stage. So I suppose this slide really is kind of a little bit repetitive, but just really I'm trying to make the point that what we're looking for here is a holistic and overall assessment. It's not a little atomized list of, oh, I have ticked all the boxes, even though there is an element, of course, of that kind of bureaucratic process. Social work multi-dimensional or multi-layered. You may tick all the boxes, but you may not make a social worker, if you see what I mean. It's quite complex, slightly magical mix of qualities and abilities, and skills and knowledge is what we are actually looking for. So when we identify just the tasks or opportunities, that really is not sufficient. We really want to think about what is the potential learning from this thing. So here's as I said, perhaps slightly patronizing, overly simple example, but we're going to talk about answering the phone, or in fact, maybe making a phone call. Now, most of us social worker people will have had to at some point make a phone call for the first time in a professional capacity. Now you don't think about it, you just pick up the phone and blah blah blah, away you go. Some calls, admittedly, you might kind of prepare for in a little bit more detail. But if you cast your mind back and see what people do the first time they've had to do this, there's a tendency perhaps to overthink it a little bit because you might be driven by anxiety. You might make a whole list, things that I must make sure I say, all of that kind of thing. And then when the actual interaction happens, and maybe the person doesn't react in the way that you expect, all our plans go out the window. So it may seem a simple little thing, but there's actually a little bit more to it. But at this stage, you have internalized that learning. You've done it many times. It doesn't really hold any fear for you. Even still, I'm sure there are some days when it does not work out as expected. So I might know about the phone and phone calls, but how would I teach that to another person? So what new knowledge and skills do I need to know in relation to this basic functional technology? So you have a number of scripts already. These are automatic ways of dealing with things. Part of social work, learning, and education, and actual fact, has become aware of our scripts, aware of our automatic ways of doing things, sometimes to uncover the power structures and processes that are involved with those to make them visible in the hope that we might change them. So, how do you write the phones? Well, obviously, I mean, I know it's laboring the point. You don't need to know how a phone works. You're more interested in the utility of it. Even though there are some phones like the Texas system that is used with domestic violence survivors that are new tech for a lot of people. Um, but really, what we want here is what you should learn from any given opportunity. Now, life is a bit weird and stuff goes a bit strange on occasion. So you can only aim for, you're not always going to get what you expect, but generally, learning is still available, as you see. As I said before, you'll be in a process of shadow, do with support, do independently, moving towards the independence. We're trying to set the timing and the pace of the learning opportunities very carefully by negotiation and discussing. We want to move out of the comfort zone, but we don't want to go anywhere near the panic zone if we can possibly avoid it. So there are ways that we kind of can think about the development of learning, and this is basically called Bloom's taxonomy of learning. Very, very well known in educational circles. But you can see there's a big difference between, well, we did know, and then we did understand how to use a phone, even though there's probably a lot more to that than we think. But then we apply that knowledge in real life situations and we're able to adapt some stuff we've learned to new conditions. We can analyze our use of phones. Do we actually ever return the phone calls, for example, that we're frequently asked to return? We can critically analyze the use of phones in social work and kind of think, is phoning a good way to actually engage with people, etc., a little bit. I know I don't mean this to be patronizing, but I'm just using it as an example and maybe think about new ways to use phones in the future. So Bloom's taxonomy looks like this. Starts with knowledge and then comprehension or understanding. Then we get to application. Then we get to analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And this has been around for a long time. And we sometimes call this kind of little pyramid from lots to HOTS. So lower order thinking skills to higher order thinking skills. Now, if you think about lower and higher order, there are verbs or words that go with these lower and higher order skills. So when we're at the bottom about remembering, and that's basically about content, if you will, we kind of use words like define, label, list, memorize, name, recall. So our learning opportunity would use those kind of words to describe what we're actually talking about. As we go up to comprehending, you can see the appearance of explain, to share that knowledge with somebody else. And then we get choose, demonstrate, dramatize. And as we kind of go further up the little pyramid, we're into analyzing, evaluating, and of course, at the end, creating. So our learning opportunities, this might be a way to guide how we write these learning opportunities because we might use these words directly in the document. So what you want to get out of this? Write a learning outcome, know what a phone is, understand how to use a phone, etc., etc. You get the kind of ideas. Critically analyze, suggest new ways. Of course, we are not likely to use phones as much anymore because we spend so much of our time online. And we could ask ourselves some critical questions about the use of online work and Zoom and Teams and all of these other things. But, you also learn from talking about these things in class. And an example the student really gave recently was they're in a Care Act review team. So they do Care Act reviews all the time, but they've never had an opportunity to do an initial review. Now, it turns out the feedback from managers and colleagues and people is, oh, your reviews are like an initial review because this person does a very thorough job each time they come to do a review. But you just have complete an initial Care Act assessment. Okay, what do we learn from this? Well, it turns out we could learn layers of things. The first one might be about PCF1, and that might be about preparation. Perhaps you read a file or referrals of paperwork that's come in. Has there been any contact with services before? But it also might involve familiarizing oneself with the actual paperwork and the form and the template, and perhaps even discussing with colleagues any kind of things that you're unsure about. And as we go through, then the case of itself may present ethical issues. So perhaps it's been referred by the fire brigade, and there are some issues about hoarding. And the last time anybody went out there, um, the individual in question, well, let's say it's the fire brigade, was a little bit defensive and aggressive and didn't want to let people into the house, even though it was very clear that there was some physical dangers present to that person in the house. You may think about equality and diversity within that context, and you will be kind of asking questions to yourself about that person's, I suppose, cognitive state, about their health conditions, about their age, various issues where we may be making assumptions about that person, which may or may not be true, but we would certainly want to query and question. So just that's the first three PCFs. You can clearly see that that one learning opportunity, um, complete an initial assessment, both affords the student with new opportunity that they didn't have before. It's generated by the students themselves or the apprentice. So that's kind of in some ways or shape or form is a really kind of valid because they're telling you this is something I want to learn, obviously. And if I went through the rest of the PCFs, you could see very clearly how we could probably meet several more of them. So you have a theoretical example here, perhaps some kind of ideas about how you write them. But it turns out the best source of information is, of course, the learner themselves. Now, learners are not going to know everything about all the opportunities that are available. So that indicates to us that the collaboration with the mentor, perhaps the university tutor, is most likely to be the most successful way of generating a significant number of learning opportunities in this initial agreement. And I think that is probably quite enough for one day. And so therefore I'm going to stop sharing and stop recording. It just remains for me to say bye. Have a nice day. Take care.